moving on to Nicole Bijlsma, and Nicole will be speaking about electrical hypersensitivity. Is your house making you sick? A little bit about Nicole. She's a woman of passion, and her passion lies in environmental medicine. She first became interested in building biology as a result of two events that occurred in her life. The first was when she began to notice a connection between many of her patients' ill health and their homes. The second was her infertility program. The cause of her 10 miscarriages was eventually identified as an immune disorder, which she now suspects arose from long-term exposure to a high electromagnetic field. Once these issues were addressed, she successfully gave birth to her children. Nicole is a popular speaker who conducts lectures on sick building syndrome and healthy homes around Australia. Nicole is an accomplished naturopath, acupuncturist and building biologist who has been in clinical practice since 1989. She is also the founder of the Australian College of Environmental Studies, which was established in 1999 to educate people about health hazards in the built environment. The college provides nationally accredited training in building biology. Nicole is also an author and has recently published Healthy Home, Healthy Family, which is the second edition. Her first edition sold out in 18 months. Can you please welcome Nicole?
Great. Thanks for providing me with an opportunity to speak today. I'd first like to ask a question, and that is, what does it say about a society where you're more likely to have a better chance of preventing the erection of a mobile phone tower, which uses the same types of frequencies as a smart meter, and argue its impact on an endangered frog or an endangered bird, and have a better chance of preventing that tower going up than you would arguing about the adverse health effects that that tower could have on children in a nearby childcare centre? And that's essentially what it's come down to. As mentioned, my interest in this began as a result of my own infertility issues. I had 10 miscarriages as a result of, I believe, sleeping near the meter box. My husband and I developed insomnia from the moment we moved into this home, and subsequently had many miscarriages. It was a reproductive immunologist in the US who finally was able to diagnose what was going on, and he indicated that something had affected my immune system to, in want of very simple terms, wipe out the fetus as if it was a cancer cell. As a result of this and investigating our home and starting to look at the research on electromagnetic fields, we relocated our bedroom, from which I then successfully had our 3 children. The twins were born in 2007, and my youngest is now 3 years of age, so I have 3 young children who are under 6. As a result of starting to see a very strong connection between many of my patients' illnesses and their homes, I started to look at the research overseas, and quite frankly I was shocked at what progressive countries were doing about the effects of electromagnetic fields, and particularly those that affect the built environment, and that's what I want to look at today. More importantly, I want to empower you and show you the simple steps of what things you can do to help reduce your exposure to these frequencies, but more importantly urge more action against the installation of smart meters. As Don mentioned, waiting for high levels of scientific proof before taking action on EMFs can lead to very high health and economic costs, as was the case with asbestos, leaded petrol and tobacco. We don't want to see this again, especially its impact on our children. Why the authorities are not acting? When I started to look at this, this is what I came up with. The exposure is imperceptible, it's ubiquitous. It's getting to a sad state of affairs where our entire planet is blanketed by radio frequencies and extra low frequencies that are affecting our homes, especially because we spent about 90% of our time inside a building. We're getting to a stage where we will not have control groups to be able to study, because we will all be impacted by these frequencies no matter where we are on the planet. It has multiple sources, from the extra low frequencies in our building wiring and our appliances, It varies over distance and time. It's difficult for science to look at cause and effect when what you have is mobile telephone companies essentially changing the frequencies all the time, the power output. We go from 2G to 3G to 4G, etc., which constantly changes the parameters. And these frequencies are radio frequencies, which is what is used in the smart meters. Secondly, it's not an ionising form of radiation, and that's largely why the medical fraternity have ignored this as a possible cause of illness. As Don mentioned, the only reason that it's considered to be health effects is at very high levels, causing thermal effects. But we now know there is so much literature now to show that adverse health effects occur at very much lower levels over a long period of time. Thirdly, brain tumours have a very long latency period. There's been a remarkable amount of research by Professor Lennart Hardell in Sweden, who has essentially looked at the development of gliomas and acoustic neuromas, two very unusual forms of brain tumours very closely associated with radio frequency exposure. These tumours take on average 15 to 25 years to develop. Now, how long has our general population been exposed to things like mobile phones? Really, we're looking only about 15 years. Now, we know asbestos had a latency period for 37 years. Many of these brain tumours are 15 to 25 years. So essentially what's going on is we'll wait to the development of the disease in the human population, and then the governments will generally react. This reactive approach is not protecting our community, and it is certainly not protecting our children who are exposed to this from a very young age. Fourthly, the lack of biomarkers. I had the good fortune to speak at the same conference as Don on Friday to a group of very open doctors who were amazed and very receptive about the research we were providing them about the adverse health effects of electromagnetic fields and its impact. My paper was on our children, the canaries in the mine, and I indicated the detail in which what our children are now exposed to and what implications that can have later in their life. The biomarkers, there are over 9 biomarkers now used in the UK, France and Sweden as pathological markers and tests, medical tests that are available to actually diagnose electrical hypersensitivity. So to say that there's no biomarkers to pick this up is actually not true. And lastly, probably the most common reason why authorities are not acting is because there's too much money to be made. We're talking about dividends for shareholders. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry. There's such a huge conflict of interest, as you can see if you have the good fortune to read Don's paper, that it is rife, and in many ways corporations do have a big say when it comes to government regulations and exposure standards. What concerned me when I started to look at the exposure standards is that the Chinese, Swiss and Russian limits for radio frequencies used in things like Wi-Fi and smart meters is 100 times lower than what is acceptable in this country. In fact, if you look at the research and the exposure standards, in Salzburg, Austria, their exposure levels for radio frequencies is 1 million times lower than what is acceptable in Australia. And I can tell you as a parent, that really concerns me. Here's an example of the radio frequencies and the differences in exposure standards amongst countries. In Australia, as Don mentioned, we follow the ICNIRP standards, International Commission on Non-Ionising Radiation, which is essentially what our PANZA's guidelines follow. For 900 megahertz used in telephone communications, the standard is 4.5 million microwatts per metre squared, and yet ours is up to 10 million microwatts per metre squared. And ironically, our standards are not a health-based standard for low-level exposure over a long period of time. We essentially do not have a standard for the frequencies that we are exposed to in our home. To give you an idea of the exposure standards for magnetic fields. Now, magnetic fields are different to radio frequencies. They come from appliances that generate current. They include the conventional metering box. They include things like the fridge, the motor from the fridge, and basically any appliance like your digital clock radios, which are on all the time. The ICNIRP standards are actually 2,000 milligauss, not 1,000. They just raised them. The Bioinitiative report indicate that it should not be beyond 1 milligauss. Now, the interesting thing about magnetic fields, which come from appliances that draw a lot of current, is that in 1979, Wertheimer and Leeper were looking at the relationship between childhood leukaemia and trying to determine what made these kids susceptible to leukaemia. In 1979, before all the privacy laws, what they did is they went to all these homes where these children lived who developed leukaemia, and they started to see that many of them lived near high voltage transmission lines. As a result of their research, they were able to show that if a child lived in a home where the exposure was beyond 4 milligauss, that their incidence of childhood leukaemia doubled. As a result of this, in 2002, the World Health Organization classified high magnetic fields of 4 milligauss or more as a class 2 carcinogen, which means possibly carcinogenic to humans. As Don mentioned, the radio frequencies used in smart meters and Wi-Fi and our mobile phones in the 31st of May last year, the World Health Organization, as a result of the enormous amount of evidence, medical evidence in journals, indicating that adverse health effects were occurring that were beyond the thermal effects, they classified radio frequencies from these sources as possibly carcinogenic to humans because they could no longer prove beyond doubt that these frequencies were safe. Setting a safe exposure limit for electromagnetic fields is meaningless because it does not account for the total exposure to thousands of types of radiation now blanketing our planet, and particularly to those who are our most vulnerable, our children, our pregnant women, people whose systems are immunocompromised or have chronic illness, and also the elderly. As I indicated, the World Health Organization classified the frequencies or radio frequencies used in smart meters, mobile phones, cordless communications like cordless baby monitors. The cordless phones, many people don't realise that cordless phones should be treated in the same way as their mobile phones because it uses the same types of frequencies, and there's an enormous amount of research and data in medical journals indicating its relationship to gliomas and acoustic neuromas, which are two unusual forms of brain tumours. Electromagnetic hypersensitivity, what is it? I'm sure many of you are likely to relate to this. Electrical hypersensitivity, or idiopathic environmental intolerance attributed to EMS, is a descriptive term for symptoms caused by exposure to electromagnetic fields. It is estimated to affect 10% of the population. Now, we know with all disease states that genetic factors make some people more susceptible to hazards like electromagnetic fields. Just look at the incidence of peanut allergies. My kids, when they went into kinder recently, we had this long list given to all the parents, including myself, as to what foods I could no longer bring into the kindergarten because a child there might have an anaphylactic response and potentially die from peanuts. We know with all disease states there's always going to be a percentage of people who are uniquely susceptible to a disease state because of epigenetic factors. We must also consider this when it comes to electromagnetic fields. Who recognises it as a functional disability? Sweden, Spain and Canada currently recognise it as a functional disability, and Australia also needs to recognise this. The most famous person to have electrosensitivity is Gro Harlem Brundtland, former Prime Minister of Norway and retired Director of the World Health Organization. Organisations who are concerned about electromagnetic fields, and let me just say this, to say that there's no evidence on the adverse health effects of EMFs is ridiculous because there have been over 30,000 medical and scientific papers on this in the last 30 years. When people talk about, brain tumours and mobile phone use, there is a lot of research for and against. The research that shows that there's no effect, there's actually only 24 major studies on mobile phones to indicate that they didn't cause brain tumours. 90% of these were funded by the telecommunications industry. What about the 20-odd other thousands of medical research papers indicating strong adverse health effects?